Welcome in, I'm Artris, and it is that time again where we have another new set on our hands. I always feel like these sets go by way too fast, but OP09 is here, super excited for this one. This one is a huge set that kind of power creeps a lot of things that are out there currently. We get a lot of great support in a bunch of different colors, and honestly, it's a great time to get into the game if you are new to the game. Even if you are a veteran player, this should be very exciting to help reinvigorate your passion for this game because there are some new leaders that are coming out that kind of switch up the meta in a way that is very fun and exciting. But before we go through the tier list, just want to say that we hit 5,000 subscribers a couple weeks back, and I promised to do a giveaway, so a giveaway we will do. Now, a little bit of a jump scare for you guys there. So in this giveaway, we're giving away these 3 Dawn, which you can get from participating in online events such as Treasure Cups and Regionals, but they have not been opened, and I've been holding on to these, and so I figured these would be good prizes to give to at least one lucky winner out there. And so the way that you enter is from December 9th all the way until December 22nd. All you have to do is be subbed to the channel, leave a comment on one of the videos in between that time frame, and also make sure you react to the announcement post within the Discord, which the Discord is linked in the description below. One lucky winner will be chosen from that. It'll be randomized, and then on the 23rd or around that time, we'll make an announcement within the Discord. I'll probably also announce it in a video as well. Once again, though, we hit 5,000 subs, and so that's why we're doing this. I really appreciate all the support. Thank you so much. We're gonna have a lot more content. As you can tell, we're putting up a video today on Monday, and so Monday and Thursdays should be the regular schedule going forward. Once again, though, cannot thank you enough for the support. On to the tier list. So usually what I like to do with my tier lists here is have the shell of the previous format in place going into the new format. So what you're seeing here is the OP08, what I thought would be kind of like the end results of the best decks in the format. And I think overall, usually I get pretty close across the board. Off the bat, I'm already seeing a couple of discrepancies, probably within the A tier. I think S tier was pretty close, maybe some B tier stuff. But for you guys that are unfamiliar with how I do my rankings here, we have S through F. S are meta-defining decks. These are decks that you can take to Treasure Cups and Regionals and expect to do very well. These leaders will take up a big portion of the top 32 pie chart. The A tier are event topping decks. These decks will likely do very well at these events, might not always consistently win them or place top 8, but you can probably see at least 1 or 2 of them within the top 16, top 32, and probably take a tournament here and there. B tier decks are competitive decks that you can take to these bigger tournaments and probably do pretty solid overall. Maybe if like a 7-3 record, 7-2 record, if you're going 9 rounds, you might be able to get into the top 16, top 8. You might not win with them, but if you do, I wouldn't be surprised, but you would have to put in a lot of the grind into the deck and also probably a little bit of luck along the way. But these decks can take games off of the A and the S tier. Now, C+ is a new section that we got in the last tier list that I made. I decided to put this in because I felt like just leave it locals was kind of too broad, and I think there's some decks out there that have potential to be good. Maybe people haven't figured them out yet, and they're kind of just like in a weird spot. And so C+ are the rogue decks. These decks could potentially do very well in a bigger tournament, and by well, I mean like top 64, maybe top 32. I don't anticipate these leaders winning tournaments, but I think if some people have put a lot of time into these specific leaders and then take them to a tournament and maybe people don't have the practice against them, they could end up being like dark horses, like sleeper agents in that sense. C tier decks are decks that are just simply leave at locals. You're probably not going to do very well in a bigger tournament with them. These could be fun decks, pet decks, maybe decks that have not enough support, or maybe just are a little bit power crept out of the meta by other decks that are in the same color. So C tier decks, once again, these are not bad, so don't take offense if your leader goes into the C tier, and please do not take offense if your leader goes into the F tier. Doesn't mean that F tier is awful, but I think that F tier, you might have some trouble even taking it to a local because maybe there's not enough support, or maybe the leader effect is just not strong enough overall. Once again, these are my opinions, so please don't take offense to it. All I ask is that if you disagree with what I say, please just be respectful in the comments. So enough about the ranking system, let's go right into it. Looking at the S tier from what I thought would be OP08, I put Bonney at the top of the OP08 meta, and I think that she was pretty strong overall. Now, looking into OP09, I don't necessarily think she'll be in the S tier. I think we'll see a few other decks pop up and be a little bit better than she is, but she is very strong regardless. Now, green doesn't get a lot of support, or at least Generic green doesn't get a lot of support, so Bonney doesn't necessarily take advantage of like the new Odyssey cards. There's a few that she might add in, but overall, her deck list is pretty set for now until maybe another set later on down the road. So I'm going to put Bonney down in maybe to the top of A tier. She will still do well overall. She has good matchup spreads into Black Yellow Luffy. I think she does really well into Doflamingo, and she does well into some of the other decks that might be in the top tier as well. So we will keep her in the A tier for now. Now, Black Yellow Luffy is one that has, I think, been the best deck in the format for OP08, and I think that Black Yellow Luffy will continue to do very well into OP09. Now, one new contender that might do really well against Black Yellow Luffy from OP09 is Teach, Black Teach, and I think that with practice and how you navigate that matchup, Black Yellow Luffy can win against Teach. So I will continue to keep Black Yellow Luffy into the S tier. I'm not sure if he's the top of S tier right now. We'll get to that as we go, but I think this is still a solid place for Black Yellow Luffy to be. Now, Lucci is one that I think has struggles against Black Yellow Luffy. It can struggle against Doflamingo if Doflamingo goes very wide and very aggressive, which, spoiler alert, in OP09 he does. And then I think Teach just turns this leader off altogether. For those that are unfamiliar, Teach is one that just says discard a card from your hand and your opponent can't activate on-play abilities, and Lucci's abilities are on play, so you're basically turning off this leader by doing that. And so because of that, I think Lucci falls down to the A tier. I still think Lucci is a very strong deck. I think Lucci is better against Bonney overall, so I might put Lucci at the top of A and keep Bonney just slightly below it, but Bonney is a very solid deck regardless. So don't get this wrong. Don't think that Bonney's bad. Don't think Lucci's bad because they're falling down to A. These are very strong decks still at the end of the day. Now, looking at Nami, I thought Nami would be an S tier deck. I don't think Nami did as well as I thought in OP08. I think Doflamingo, once they got the support in 8.5, really just ran over Nami, and so that kind of discouraged a lot of Nami players from playing her. I think that Doflamingo is going to be still an S tier deck in my opinion, and so Nami probably doesn't want to deal with that. Nami also doesn't want to deal with Teach, and Nami might have some difficulty with some other leaders as well. I think Nami's still a good choice, and there is some good support. When I say good, I mean like 1 or 2 cards overall that Nami gets in OP09 that really help do what you want to do with this leader. For instance, I think it's the 1-drop Nami that when it attacks, you can look at the top 5 and get a blue event. That's incredibly powerful for Nami overall. So I will put Nami into the A tier. I don't think she's quite S tier in OP09. Now, Dofi is a deck that I think we have seen a lot in the East do very well. And I think Dofi will continue to be a powerhouse in the West. Now, he hasn't really taken off nearly as much in 8.5 as maybe some people expected, just because like Lucci was still around and could handle the bodies pretty efficiently. And Black Yellow Luffy actually has a decent matchup into Dofi, believe it or not. I think most people probably understand that. So I'm going to leave Dofi probably right around here. It's a very close, like it's almost a 50-50 between Dofi and Black Yellow Luffy for me as like best deck in the format. But I'm going to leave Dofi here because I do think that Black Yellow Luffy has just such a strong advantage against most decks. And I think that Black Yellow Luffy probably piloted to the best of its abilities and a Dofi piloted to the best of its abilities. I feel like Black Yellow Luffy probably would come out on top in those matchups. So I will leave Dofi in the S tier, but I think these two could be interchangeable for number 1. Now on to Reiju. I thought this would be an event-topping deck, and it was not. It was not a deck that did very well as far as 8 or 8.5 goes. There were a few people that stuck with it, and I saw a couple of tops here and there, like maybe snuck into the top 32. And I think that it will still be a deck that you could probably pilot and do okay with, but because of the resurgence of like red in this set with especially Shanks, and then also like I mentioned Teach, those two decks will probably do very well against Reiju. I will put Reiju down to the B tier, top of B right now. It's a competitive deck. I could expect it maybe to hit a top 64, maybe a top 32. Will it hit a top 16 or top 8 consistently? I don't think so. I could be wrong here, but I don't think it will be quite that good. Moria doesn't get much support in this set. A lot of the black cards that come out in OP09 are tailored towards Teach, less so other leaders like Lucci or Moria. Now, Moria does get like a card or two that could be fit into his deck. However, I don't think that's enough to make Moria amazing. I feel like Moria might fall down really hard after this. I think Moria is still a solid deck overall, right? It runs the 8-cost Moria. However, I think the problem here is that there's just better decks to play in this color. That being, Lucci or Teach. So I'm going to also move Moria down to the B tier. He might even fall down to the Rogue tier, but I think right now we'll be fair and keep Moria in B. This is not necessarily where he'll end up. I'm not saying he's at the top of B. We're going to go through with this as we're looking at them and kind of make our assessments as we move around. Once we get down to the C tier, that's where I kind of not really be specific on where they fall within the C tier, but I think we can probably pick and choose our battles here in the B, A, and the S tiers. Perona is also one that I think is not nearly as good as sets go along. Her being a 4-life leader against some of these 5-life leaders that are very aggressive can be very difficult for Perona to be able to set up what she needs. However, she does get some good support in OP09, and by good support, I mean one piece of support, really. The support that she gets is a 2K that searches out a Thriller Bark Pirate card, so she is able to actually search for the 8-cost Moria, which is really big for Perona, but is that good enough for her to be an event-topping deck? I don't think so. I think that she probably also suffers from the same thing that Moria suffers from, is she probably just, there's better leaders to play in similar colors, but she's still very strong, I would say, at the end of the day. I'm going to put her in the B tier competitive. I might actually put her above Moria and maybe even above Reiju, just because she can search out the 8-cost Moria now, which is something that was a problem before. You were not able to search that out. Your primary search targets were Land of Wano cards, and so when you're looking for Land of Wano cards, you are bottom decking 8-cost Moria, so you have to draw into it naturally. But now you can actually search into it and have an 8-cost Moria play on curve, which is really huge for Perona. Katakuri is one that I didn't see too much of in 8 or 8.5, but I definitely think he is the strongest yellow leader. I don't know, actually, Enel's one of those that's probably going to continuously be the best yellow leader, but I think Katakuri, when he sees his stuff, is just really hard to beat. The 10-cost Big Mom is always a threat. You have to race Katakuri down, and if you're too slow, then you're going to lose those matchups. And on top of that, yellow does get some okay support that Katakuri can take advantage of. I don't know how much Katakuris have been teching in the new Nico Robin, the 6-cost Nico Robin, or even maybe the Kuzan. I didn't see that much in the East, but it is a potential you can add into this deck that makes this deck pretty strong, because one of the issues that this deck has always had is, what do I do on my 6 Dawn turn? Or my 7 Dawn turn is usually just relegated to playing 7-cost Big Mom. But now you can actually play a 6-cost Nico Robin, crit a life off of your opponent, and then use your leader ability on 7 Dawn. So there are some new plays you can make with Katakuri that are pretty potent. So I would maybe put Katakuri into the competitive tier. I think Katakuri probably is around here. Not sure if this is the right spot, but we'll figure this out as we go along. And then same thing with Enel. Enel is... in this format, I think Enel is probably the stronger of the two between Katakuri and Enel being yellow leaders. However, with Teach just turning off all on-play abilities, this hurts yellow overall because most of yellow's cards are on play. So what does this mean for Enel? Enel has to play a lot differently, has to make their deck list tailored to be able to beat Teach, but also handle a lot of the meta. One thing that is very advantageous about playing Enel is that you have a great matchup against Blue Doflamingo. You also have a decent matchup against Black Yellow Luffy. You can make that matchup like a 50-50, and that's if you can have a 50-50 against Black Yellow Luffy and then have an advantageous matchup against Blue Doflamingo. I think that Enel's a pretty solid deck. I don't know if he's necessarily an event-topping deck. I might put him slightly above Nami here. He could be an A-tier deck. He might also be at the bottom of A-tier. It could be one of these where we'll figure it out as we go along. He does have struggles against Nami. He always has. However, with the new Nico Robin in the deck, if you want to use Nico Robin, you actually have a pretty good matchup against Nami, being able to crit the top of their life all the way down until they're at 2 life, if you're running 4 of at least. So Enel might be one to watch out for. Usually Enel does really good at the start of sets, and then as sets go along, usually he falls off. So maybe Enel will be an event-topping deck at the start of OP09 because people are still figuring out what the meta looks like, and Enel usually doesn't change too much overall and can be kind of this annoying deck to have to deal with as people are trying to figure out the decks that they're new to. Then we have Uta, which I thought Uta would be a strong pick with all of the support from the starter decks in OP05, or 8.5, OP05. That's a while back. But I think Uta didn't do nearly as well as I thought. I think that the Shanks that Uta got from the starter deck, the one that KOs a rested unit regardless of cost, was better in Bonney than Uta, and I think Uta's consistency is one of the things that makes it very good. However, I think the pieces in the film package just aren't necessarily strong overall. You would have to probably play more, or I guess less film to be able to have a strong Uta deck. And what I mean by that is like including like 8 cost Kid or 10 cost Doflamingo. And that's not necessarily what Uta really wants to do. And so because of that, I think Uta falls off. I'm going to put her into competitive. I think she can still be a deck that does well. She's a deck that if you're going to a big tournament has great consistency. And I think consistency in tournaments is probably the most important factor when going into a tournament. So I will put Uta in a competitive tier. I don't know if she's necessarily uber strong. I don't think she's a rogue deck. I don't think that like she's been figured out, right? People understand what her deck list is supposed to look like. And I think when piloted to like an average, she's probably good. Her floor isn't necessarily, or I guess her ceiling necessarily isn't super high, but her floor isn't necessarily super low either. So she's kind of like a pretty decent, like solid pick for maybe newer players, or maybe players that just want to not have to worry about like, oh, I need to find my pieces, because like Uta does a very good job at that. Now on to Kalgara. I think Kalgara definitely was a competitive deck in 8. However, I don't think Kalgara does nearly as well in this new set. I think Kalgara falls off just because like other decks around him do a lot better. He is a very unique yellow leader, being able to take his life and then play out, like cheat out bodies. And that could be something that could come up against like Teach. However, the bodies he plays, like the biggest one he plays, is not going to be able to break through Teach or threaten Teach very much, which is the 6 cost Kalgara, which is for 8,000 power. So I'm going to put Kalgara down at the C tier, leave it locals. I don't think he's a rogue deck. I don't think this deck is necessarily going to be able to do very well in a big tournament like a top 64. Even with like maybe some people cooking, I just don't think it will do well. I think it's a strong deck overall. And this is what I mean when I say like don't get offended if your leader goes down to the C tier. Kalgara at its core is a very strong deck. However, I just don't think it has the gas to compete with a lot of the other decks that get good support from OP09. Zoro's a deck that I think will always consistently be in a top tier of some sort. We just saw, I think it was like maybe at the time of this recording last night, when I saw Zoro was playing in a Japanese championship. It might have even been like in the top 4, maybe top 8. I'm not quite sure where the Zoro player fell, but they made it that far, right? And so they were playing the animal version, which is like the chopper version. And so seeing that in OP010, or I guess OP10, is it OP010 or is it OP10? I'm not sure what people are calling it, to be quite honest. But the fact that it was still there and had a very much like the same core, I think is very telling for Zoro, because Zoro is just a generically good leader. Red gets good cards within this next set in OP09. I don't know if Zoro takes a lot of advantage of those cards. The only card that I think Zoro will be able to really utilize will be the new 10 cost Gold D Roger, being able to, you know, win the game on the spot if your opponent chooses to use a blocker if you or your opponent are at 0 life. And Zoro's really good at putting people to 0 life. And so having an additional win condition within Zoro outside of like a Diablo Jambe is very strong for this leader. So I think Zoro belongs in the competitive tier, probably towards the tail end of competitive. And so right now, what we're looking at, Zoro is the tail end right now. And so we'll figure this tier out as we go through the other leaders. Now, Purple Luffy, easy. This is an S tier deck for me. I think Purple Luffy actually might be better than Doflamingo. And you might call me crazy, but I feel like Purple Luffy, with the amount of support that Purple gets in OP09, whether it's like the 7 cost Rush Sanji, the 9 cost Rush Secret Luffy, the 1 cost event, it's like the 1 cost event that pitches a card at +4 and then you draw 2. Those cards make Purple Luffy extremely scary. I think that Purple Luffy has a strong advantage against Doflamingo. I could be crazy. I know that in 8.5, Doflamingo ran over this deck, but Purple Luffy didn't have what it gets from 9. And I think all of the defensive units and the fact that you have plays to make it 7 that are not just like Luffy Taro, you can be really aggressive, you can play the 9-cost Luffy. I think all of these things combined make Luffy a slightly better deck than Doflamingo, and it could potentially take games against Black Yellow Luffy, especially being able to rest their Sabos and have a huge swing come in. You have the Uso Hachi, the 3-cost not even event, it's like a character. It's a 2-cost, or sorry, it's a 3-cost 2k counter that rests, I think, a 5-cost or less on play. And so having that as like a win condition against Black Yellow Luffy makes Purple Luffy very strong. Having some big bodies that come down earlier than what they're supposed to makes it strong against other decks. And I think Purple Luffy's in a really good spot in OP09. Blue-green, Zoro and Sanji. Now this one, I'm going to put down at the Rogue tier. I thought it would be competitive in the last set. I thought more people might try to play it from all the Warlord support that we got in the structure decks, but I don't think people really messed around with it too much, and I think it still is very strong, very viable. It's got a lot of potency to it. The fact that it can run like 7-cost Hody Jones, it can run the 10-cost Doflamingo and search that out, by the way. Those are very strong things for this deck to be able to do. But I think people just haven't played enough of it. And so I'm going to put it into the Rogue tier. I think maybe some people might need to play a little bit more of it and figure out, oh, how does this work? Maybe, you know, it could be a good deck against a lot of the meta. But overall, Zoro Sanji probably not going to end up in a top 64 in a tournament unless somebody really, really cooks with it. So we'll see, though. And then we're on to Boa. I think Boa is probably competitive, maybe towards the... I'm going to say this is the competitive tail end. Because Boa has a really strong matchup against a lot of decks, but it also has a really bad matchup against a lot of decks that are above it, right? So this deck does very well against, I think, Black Yellow Luffy. I think it does very well against decks like maybe Teach. I think it might even do well against Shanks. Not even maybe. I think it does do well against Shanks. But it struggles against decks like Lucci. I think that Doflamingo might be a little bit too fast for it. And so those decks, if it runs into it, you might have some issues as Boa. But if you run into the other side of the bracket where you're running into like the Teach or the Shanks or the Black Yellow Luffys and you're able to like bottom deck all of their stuff, then you're probably in a decent spot. And I think Boa is kind of like in the middle of like, it's a really good deck, but it's also a really bad deck. So which one is it? I'm not sure, but I think it might be at the bottom of competitive. It's not a rogue deck, and I don't think it's like going to have any issues making it to a top tier anytime soon, but I just think that not enough people pilot this deck overall, and that's probably why we don't see it top very often. Then looking at Red Purple Luffy, now Red Purple Luffy is in the best of both worlds here. It's in red and it's in purple. These two colors got huge buffs in OP09 with the 10-cost Shanks. A lot of the other support, like maybe Ben Beckman, 7-cost Ben Beckman in red, and of course all of the purple good stuff that we get in OP09 really bumps this leader up a lot, in my opinion. I think this leader is in A tier for sure. Where does it fall in A tier? I think it might fall above Enel. It might fall a little bit below Bonney. I think Bonney might have a slight advantage against it. I think Lucci might be able to handle Red Purple Luffy. I don't know how well, though, because like Red Purple Luffy is able to search out top end now with some of the other support, like the 1-cost Searcher Law. You can use that if you want. I think there's other builds where you just go like a bunch of top end, you race to get to there first, and then you have a lot of cards that draw you the 1-cost event. Once again, this event is insane, especially in Red Purple Luffy, being able to basically protecting yourself, and then also, I guess it's not technically drawing you 2 cards because you're pitching a card and then playing the event, so you're going net neutral. But I think that you refreshing your hand in a sense is very, very important for this leader. One of the problems with this leader is it just doesn't draw enough, and so it doesn't see its pieces. However, if you're running the 9-cost Luffy that on play has rush and draws, this is really strong. Newgate is one. Newgate's a leader that has always been very interesting to me, where I'm not sure if it's strong or not. I think that there's a little bit of a surprise factor with Newgate. I think that there's some players out there that are diehard Newgate fans, and they will continue to try to make this deck work. And I think that it does very well against a lot of the meta. I think the problem here is that as time goes on, there's just more and more decks that really just know how to be able to beat this or have slight advantages against Newgate. But one important thing here is that Newgate has access to Goldie Roger, and Newgate just naturally goes down to 0. So you have to be very careful about playing against Newgate with the Goldie Roger in place. I don't think it's quite a competitive deck right now. I think maybe it needs a little bit of help, maybe some extra support, maybe just unban the boat. Maybe that's what this deck needs at the end of the day. Because I think by now we're into OP09, so we've had 7 sets where Moby Dick has been banned. Just unban it at this point, and then make Newgate on like an event topping deck again, please. I mean, I'm biased because I think Newgate's just a cool character, but I would like to see Boat unbanned at some point, and so that would make Newgate really strong. But in the meantime, I think he's probably a rogue tier deck with a little bit of help from Goldie Roger coming in and maybe making this deck potentially upset some people. So, you know, could potentially get into the top 32. Who knows? Yamato is a deck that I think is still always going to be relatively decent as well, kind of like with Newgate. However, I don't think it's quite competitive with how many leaders are 5 life now, and 5 life leaders are usually pretty solid against Yamato because they can hold on to that last life and be pretty safe against the aggression that Yamato brings. If you're a 4 life leader, you're going to have trouble against Yamato for the most part, in my opinion. And I don't think green really gets any good support for Yamato. All of the green support, or most of the green support rather, goes to the new leader Lim. Yellow doesn't necessarily get a lot of support for what Yamato's trying to do. You could play the new Nico Robin, and it could be a decent card for you to play. Not quite sure if you want to go that route with Yamato. Not much has changed with this deck. And the fact that there's a bunch of 5 life leaders coming into play here could be an issue for Yamato at the end of the day. So I think just like Newgate, like its counterpart here, I think it belongs in the rogue tier. I think it could be a deck that might take some people by surprise if they're not used to playing against it. If Yamato high rolls, then it's going to be a very good deck. But if it just does what it normally does, I think for the most part, a lot of the decks above it won't have too much of an issue going against Yamato. But this deck is still pretty decent, and I could expect to see a couple of them at bigger tournaments, maybe even do well. From time to time, there's like Yamatos that pop up at these big tournaments and like end up doing very well. So I'd like to be proven wrong on Yamato, but I think for the time being, they belong into the C+ rogue tier. Then we're looking at Purple Kaido, Mono Purple Kaido. I think Kaido, because purple just gets a lot of good stuff, I think Kaido really benefits just from generic good stuff. So the fact that the 7-cost Sanji can be played in this deck, the fact that like the 9-cost Rush Luffy, the 1-cost event, you have a lot of stuff in this deck that you can switch things out for and probably be pretty strong. So I think Kaido belongs in a competitive tier, might be slightly above where it's at currently, where I put it last. But I'm not expecting this deck to do amazing, but I do think that this deck has some legs and can do very well at the end of the day. Now, looking at Vegapunk, I thought Vegapunk is a great answer to Doflamingo. I think Vegapunk has a lot of good answers to other decks as well and can kind of play a long game better than some, but also can play a quick game a lot better than some too. So Vegapunk is very versatile in how it's built and how it plays. And I think that this deck, because Doflamingo is one of the strongest decks and will be one of the most represented decks, I think that Vegapunk, therefore, moves up to probably close to the top of competitive. I think I'm going to put it at the top of competitive above Perona. I don't think it's quite an event-topping deck. I think that some people have done well with it in the past, in 8, in 8.5, and I think that it will probably have the similar game style, or gameplay rather, and overall, because there's more Doflamingo in the meta, I think Vegapunk really benefits from that. Marco is a leader that I'm really glad to see some people do very well with. We've had like Vampire Gaming, we've had, of course, Eggman do very well with this leader, and as we've seen those players do well, I think more people have picked this deck up and tried it out, and I think this deck has been successful for the people that have put time into it. I don't know if it's going to be good in OP09 though, and what I mean by I don't know, it means I don't think so. I think that this deck might have some issues against some of the top decks overall. I think it has a fair chance against like Doflamingo, but I think Purple Luffy might be a little bit too aggressive or hit its curve faster, of course. I think the fact that Teach turns off all on-play abilities, and especially since Marco's deck is a lot of just on-play abilities, Marco might have some issues against that. I think it could be a rogue deck. I think it's better than maybe Newgate or Yamato, but I don't know if it's quite good enough to compete with some of the other decks up here. Let me just take a quick look and see what we have. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it does okay. I think I'm probably thinking a little too narrowly, just like focusing in on the Teach matchup. But I think that maybe Marco still belongs in competitive tier. I don't think it belongs at the bottom of competitive tier. I think it's better than like Moria, for instance. And I think it might have the same power level as like a Katakuri. To be honest, as we're going through this, I'm not sure if Reiju belongs this high up in the competitive tier. I could see Reiju falling a little bit further down here, maybe being around this area. Maybe Perona going here. I think this is probably a safe bet overall, putting these leaders in this section or this area. And maybe even moving Zoro up as well. Zoro probably belongs about right there. And then finally putting from the competitive tier of 8, what I had her at before. I don't really think that she is quite competitive in OP09. 4 life leaders kind of do struggle a little bit. Of course, she is able to ramp up quickly and get to 10 cost Big Mom. I think the fact you're going to see a lot of Doflamingo, which is arguably a nightmare scenario for Pudding, is going to be a problem. I think that Teach turns off a lot of the on-play abilities as well. So Pudding is going to struggle. I will actually move Pudding down to the top of C tier, leave it locals. Not because it's a bad deck, once again, just because of the fact that there's other decks that are coming into the fray that will counter Pudding and make Pudding's life very difficult. Now, going into the C+ Rogue tier, I think that Chopper is a deck that probably doesn't get too much support in OP09. Of course, there's good red stuff, but I don't think Chopper really takes advantage of that. Chopper wants to play more of the Drum Kingdom or the animal type. And so because we don't get a lot of that support, and to my knowledge, maybe not any support for that, I could be wrong here, I think Chopper probably is not going to do so well in OP09. I think it's a leave it locals deck, so we're going to put it below Kalgara because I definitely think Kalgara and Pudding are a little bit better than this deck overall. And then I think Carrot is a deck that, oh, man, it's one of those where it's just like Bonney is just kind of like what Carrot does, but slightly better, right? Carrot has a slightly different play style because it plays more of the minks, and you rest your 5 cost characters of your opponent, and then you can like suspend them. But I think Bonnie's just like better at green, just good green stuff than Carrot. And we didn't see enough people play Carrot. I definitely think it's a good deck, but I just think it belongs in the C tier for OP09. I'm probably going to make a lot of people mad by moving some of these things to the leave it locals, but trust me, like this set is that crazy where you get a lot of just good stuff for other decks or just new leaders that do really well against some of these leaders that it's just insane that we're seeing the power creep in these tier lists. Then we have the Black Luffy from Starter Deck 14. I saw this deck do very well for a little while. I think it was in 7, and then in 8, it didn't do nearly as hot, but it's just like generically good black stuff. The problem is I think Lucci's just a better black deck, and I think that Moria is a better black deck, and Moria plays obviously a different style than Luffy, but I think this Luffy isn't awful, but I still think it's probably one where it's not really a rogue deck. I think people kind of have figured out what belongs in it, and so it could be a deck that might do well. It might like finish 6-4 in a tournament, but I think that there's just other decks that you'll see pop up that might do really well against this Black Luffy. Because like Black Luffy's issue is that Black Luffy can take care of one character a turn. When you have decks like Shanks that do put out one character a turn, but those characters are massive, and then you have like Blackbeard that, or Teach rather, that has the on-play abilities nullified. And then you have like Doflamingo, which is just super aggressive. You have Black Yellow Luffy, which just naturally does well against like black decks, even though the +1 cost is a slight annoyance for Black Yellow Luffy. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day because Black Yellow Luffy is just going to push through anyway. And then Purple Luffy is just good. So yeah, I'm going to put the Starter Deck 14 Luffy at the C tier, leave it locals. I'm actually going to put it at the top because we have seen it do very well overall in general. But it's one that I probably wouldn't advise taking to a bigger tournament. Then we have the Sakazuki. I still think that this blue-black leader is a rogue tier deck. I think that there are some people that have messed around with the old Navy package and probably have figured out something and haven't really debuted it to the world quite yet. Maybe we'll see some people test more with this leader, but blue and black being the most powerful colors in the game, to me, I think makes it a rogue deck because it hasn't been quite figured out and it has potential to do well. Same thing with Rebecca. In 8, I played Rebecca and I luckily did very well with her in one of the tournaments, but I think overall she's in a weird spot because Doflamingo is really, really aggressive against her, and it's just a hard thing for Rebecca to deal with. I think Rebecca does well against Black Yellow Luffy, it does well against Bonney, could do well against Teach, it might do well against Shanks. With the right build, I think you might want to go more of a control style as opposed to a tempo build, so you might want to look to do like a 10-cost Kuzan. In OP09, if you're looking to go more of the Rebecca route, I think Rebecca probably stays in the rogue tier because I think, once again, she just hasn't been figured out, and she's kind of like, it's like a OP010 or OP10 waiting room overall with all of the Dressrosa support that she's going to get. Looking at Red Green Law, I think Red Green Law is one where if you're piloting it correctly, you could do very well. I know that some people have tried it out in 8 and I think have done decent overall. The fact that it can just spit out bodies, and I guess its worst matchup will be Lucci, but I think Lucci being brought down a tier or so because of other decks rising up might make Law have a little bit of a resurgence. So I could see Law being a rogue tier deck. Then we have Blue Yellow Ace, and I think Blue Yellow Ace was in a good spot in 7. I think 8, it fell off a little bit, and I think because there's not a lot that it gets in 9, I think that it's probably a deck you want to leave at locals. It probably, we saw it actually top recently in, I think, an overseas tournament in 10, but the deck list wasn't much different than what you look at now, and so maybe it was like a matter of they played decks that were really good to play against. I'm not sure what their matchups were, but I think Blue Yellow Ace, it just struggles from some consistency issues overall, being either really high rolly or just really low rolly. So Blue Yellow Ace, because of that, if you're taking it to a big tournament, is probably not going to do well at the end of the day. It might do like a 5-5, 6-4 on a really good day, 7-3 maybe. So I'm going to put him down at the C tier, which sucks because I really like this leader and hoped it to do better than what it's doing or has done. But I don't think it's quite that good. Vivi for me is going to be a rogue tier, probably always a rogue tier for me, just because it's a leader that people don't really expect to do well. And I think because there are some good red cards that it gets, it can replace Borsalino, the 7-cost Borsalino in blue, with now the Ben Beckman, which has a counter on it, and it's the same cost. Slightly less power overall to attack with, but that doesn't really matter for Vivi because 7k is just still really good. And of course, Vivi might replace some of its top end with the new 10-cost Shanks, so who knows? Maybe there's a Vivi build out there that somebody might cook up, that person being me, that could be decent, but we'll see overall. I think Vivi has potential to do okay, so we'll see as we go along. Foxy is a very interesting leader here because Foxy, I think, has been mostly like laughed at as a leader, like, oh, this leader is just kind of like a joke. It's not necessarily that great. It's just like middle of the pack. However, it does very good against Doflamingo. We've seen quite a lot of Foxy players rise up in the East and do well, especially in bigger tournaments. I think Foxy belongs in the competitive tier. I think Foxy probably goes above like a Katakuri, maybe even top of competitive tier. I could see it doing very well against some of these decks up here. I think it's a deck that people kind of tend to like scoff at because it doesn't have a lot of fighting power overall. It's like biggest characters are like the 7-cost Foxy. Yeah, once again, purple gets a lot of good stuff, and Foxy can just take advantage of generically good purple stuff. As a result, Foxy goes to the top of competitive. Red Yellow Sabo is a deck that actually gets some good support in 09. It gets some Revolutionary Army support, and I'm going to be honest, I think this deck belongs in maybe a competitive tier. I think it belongs out of the rogue tier at least, because of just the amount of support it gets from OP09. And already it was a deck that can be difficult to pilot against if you're not knowing how to play against it. It could be running triggers, it could be running Rev Army. It has a couple different builds it can go with, and I think this deck belongs in the bottom of B tier. I think it's a competitive deck. I could see somebody doing like maybe a top 64 with it, maybe squeak into top 32. That might be a little bit ambitious for this leader, but I don't think it's a leader to frown at for sure. I think it's a leader that might be decent. Now, looking at Purple Yellow Croc, I think this leader it's pretty defined on what it does. It definitely ramps up, likes to play yellow, big stuff, but now it has some purple, big stuff it can play. I think this leader might slightly bump up within the rogue tier. I don't think it's quite competitive, though. I think we could probably see it with all the purple stuff it gets. Maybe bump up here. I don't know. C tiers are kind of just like free-for-alls. The rogue tier I try to be a little bit more specific on, but I don't know. These could all be interchangeable at the end of the day, too. Who knows? Then we're looking at Oden. The one Oden player out there that always does very well at tournaments is probably like, why is this in the rogue tier? But I think that rogue is probably its best bet because it's a leader that not a lot of people see play. Not a lot of people know how to play against it. Not that it's a hard leader to play against or play, but it's a good leader overall. Being able to get that free value from its leader ability. There's not a lot of support that it got, though. You could run some of the new stuff in red for it. Once again, green didn't really get much, but I think that its package that it has currently is strong enough for it to still be a rogue tier deck where it might take some games off people and surprise people in bigger tournaments. I'm going to put Ace at the top of rogue tier because, well, you know, what better to have father and son together, you know? So I think Ace with the red good stuff that it gets from, you know, OP09, not that it gets it, I think it can take advantage of it. Goldie Roger is a very strong card for just red in general, and Ace being able to get people's life totals down to 0 quickly is very advantageous for it, especially with the Goldie Roger. So I'm going to put Ace at the top of rogue tier. I don't think it's quite good enough to be a competitive deck because it feels like it's missing something. I'm not sure what it's missing. I played a lot of Ace when it came out, and I've kind of like dabbled with it in every set to see where it stands, and yeah, it just feels like something's missing, but I'm not quite sure. I do think Goldie Roger helps bump this leader up and make it a little bit better than what it was in the last set. Green-purple Doflamingo, the fact that it's purple just makes it slightly better. The fact that it has actually a really good matchup against the blue Doflamingo, being able to play Birdcage and rest all of the, or keep the suspended characters rested is very nice. But this leader kind of just is like a whatever leader to me. It doesn't really do much as far as what I've seen in tournaments. 4 life is tough, of course, but I don't think that's really what's the problem here. I think the problem might be it doesn't really ramp up that much. Like, being purple, you would expect it to ramp up faster, but it just mostly plays the Doflamingo, or I guess the Donquixote Pirates package, which doesn't really do much ramping. It plays more like rest style stuff. You could maybe look to play purple good stuff, green good stuff, and maybe this leader could be okay. The fact that it has a good matchup against blue Doflamingo kind of makes it decent in my opinion, and I still think it belongs in rogue tier. I don't know if it bumps up though. I think it probably just stays around where it's at. Next we have Rosinante, blue-green. I'm always going to leave this in the rogue tier. I feel like it just needs to be worked on more. I really like its defensive capabilities. I like the fact that it has access to removal like Red Rock or Gravity Blade, and then it can play bigger bodies with its 9 and 10 Dawn. But it's just never done super well overall. I think maybe a tournament or two in the East for 9 we saw it do well. This is a leader I'll try to mess with a little bit for some videos later on, but I think that this leader just needs a little bit of help, maybe some support. I don't know what it quite needs, but I still think it's a rogue tier deck because it just has like good stuff. It's just like the right combination of what that good stuff could be. Smoker is a deck that got a lot of support with its starter deck, and by a lot of support I mean mostly the Tashigi. The 5-cost Tashigi is actually just insane at what it does. Being able to trash a character, keep the character on board so that your leader can get the leader effect off. I think the Smoker is probably towards the bottom of event topping. It did very well. It did a lot better than I expected it to do. I thought it would do well with the new starter deck, but it did really well in 8.5, and I think the fact that it doesn't change too much from 8.5 to 9 makes it a strong leader still overall. I think it has good removal. Most of its removal is going to be single target based as opposed to like a Lucci where it multi-targets. But still, that being said, it has access to a lot of good black stuff, good removal overall, and I think this deck just really benefited from having the structure deck come out around the time that it did. All right, looking through what we haven't already covered, Belo Betty. All right, Belo Betty is a deck that I actually think belongs out of the C tier and maybe even into the competitive tier. I think this deck hits hard, hits fast, and in the meta where you need to hit hard and fast, Belo Betty might be the deck for a lot of people. It gets good Rev Army support for it. in OP09. It gets a couple of interesting blockers. The fact that you can turn your searchers into attackers very easily with your leader ability has always been very strong. The problem with this deck is it's like a glass cannon. You either win really hard or you lose really hard. You can starve yourself out pretty easily if you're not careful. But I think Belo Betty might be a strong competitive deck. I'm going to put Belo Betty probably around here, maybe around this. I think that she's pretty strong overall. I don't know if people are going to try to play her because like everybody likes to play the flavor of the month with like Shanks or Teach or whatever it may be. But I think Belo Betty, you might want to watch out for that one. And same thing with Dragon. Dragon could be a good deck as well. The amount of red good stuff makes it a potential rogue deck. I think this bumps up. I don't think it's quite competitive because you're going to have decks like Shanks be just a better red deck overall. But this could take advantage of like maybe the new Ben Beckman, maybe even take advantage of like the 10 cost Shanks. So it could be a rogue deck. I'm going to move it up to the C+ tier. Sabo being red and black has always been an interesting color combination in this game where they don't really synergize too well. But I think the fact that, red has just good stuff again, I think may help Sabo become a better leader against some of the other decks. The fact that it can stop a KO, doesn't have to be an effect KO, just a KO once per turn, very powerful. Of course, Ben Beckman can go around that, so if you are playing decks like Shanks or going against any red deck, you have to think that could be a potential problem. Besides that, though, I think Sabo is probably a deck maybe in the C+ rogue tier. I have seen some people in 8.5 mess around with it a little bit and do okay, actually. And I think the fact that, red does get, like I said, some support that might help it out. Maybe some people could take some of the new red stuff. Not necessarily into the black stuff. Like, I don't think the black cards are meant for any deck other than Teach for the most part. So it does have like that problem of just the stuff that already exists being the stuff you can only work with. But the red stuff that it does get could be very strong for its arsenal. All right, red, purple, Uta. This one is a very interesting one that as time has gone on, this deck has gotten better and better, but nobody really plays it. I think the fact that, once again, red and purple both have a lot of stuff in this next set that make it strong. Why would that not apply to the red, purple Uta? This is a good question, right? I think that this Uta belongs... I am going to put it at the bottom of competitive. I think this could be either a top of the rogue tier, bottom of the competitive. I might be coping a little bit here. I do think that the fact that, this leader does get access to just being able to use the 10 cost KO Shanks with its leader ability and KO anything other than Roger at this point is very strong. It can run the 10 cost Shanks. It can run any of the new purple stuff like the 7 cost Sanji. It can run the 9 cost Luffy. It can run a lot of just good stuff overall. Yeah, this leader, to me, bumps up from the Leave It locals to the bottom of competitive. I don't necessarily expect it to do super well. I don't think a lot of people will play it. And of course, the more people play a deck at a tournament, the more chances it has to do well. So because I don't think a lot of people are going to be playing this, we might not see this actually top or do well in the grand scheme of things. On to Iceberg. Iceberg is one that is a purple leader that could still benefit from just like generically good purple stuff. Does it really need to be ran? I mean, if you're going to run this leader, Iceberg, or the purple Kaido, I'd probably go with the purple Kaido. But that's not saying that this is a bad leader overall. I'm going to move it up to the rogue tier. I think some people might want to try this out and see how it goes. Purple has been getting stronger and stronger every set, and I think this set really makes purple, puts it into overdrive as far as like a competitive color overall. I think purple's always kind of been that color where it's like, come on, help us out, help us out. And it finally, for a couple of sets, has gotten like a small like morsel of stuff here and there to the point now that it's had a full course meal. And I think that this color is very good. Yellow Linlin, I think this is probably just a Leave It locals, but I think it's a very strong Leave It locals, probably towards the top of Leave It locals. If you're going to play a yellow deck overall, I understand that Linlin plays slightly different than Katakuri. However, I think Katakuri is the better yellow leader. This Linlin can take advantage of all the stuff that Katakuri takes advantage of. but I just think that Katakuri is just a better leader overall. Not saying that Linlin is bad, but I don't think that Linlin would be taken to a bigger tournament as opposed to like a Katakuri. And if she is taken to a bigger tournament, how beneficial is having the knowledge of life plus also swinging 7 as compared to stacking your life? That's a tough one. I think that the Katakuri is probably just the better leader. Ivankov doesn't really move for me. I think it's still a leave it locals, and I don't think it's a very good leave it locals, but once again, I'm not going to really like harp on where these should lie. If I feel like it bumps up, then I'll move it around. I don't really want to bump it down though for the time being, because, well, I mean, Ivankov doesn't change much. Its support has kind of ceased to exist after EB01. The blue stuff that comes out in OP09 is really beneficial for Buggy and mostly just Buggy. Like I said, there's a Nami support piece, but the rest of it is kind of like your cross guild, your Buggy support, and doesn't really have any impel down, unfortunately. And so I do think Ivankov has a good, strong core as is, but I think the fact that it just doesn't really change much from the previous set to this set keeps it at the C tier, leave it locals. Kid has the same problem that I think that Carrot has, where it's like, just play Bonney if you're going to play a green leader, because the green stuff that comes out doesn't really apply to Kid. And if you're going to play a leader in green, always stick with Bonney for the time being, because I think the resting leader or character is far more beneficial to the state of a game for that player than swinging twice with your leader and then pitching a card. This effect is still very good, right? It's a generically good effect, but I think that Kid obviously wants to play more aggressive, Bonney more of a defensive green, and because of that, I think Kid just doesn't really change much, so we're going to keep him in the C tier. Arlong doesn't get much in yellow or green. Once again, this leader kind of just stays the same. There might be a couple things you could add in from yellow, but I just don't think that it's worth trying to make the deck different than what it already is. So I think Arlong just stays where it's at. Queen is a deck that I think is interesting. It did get a couple of pieces of support from the starter deck. Of course, I think that the Nico Robin, the 6 cost, could be very good in this deck as well, just like creating a life off of your opponent. This is one of those where I'm going to bump it up. I still think it's a C tier, leave it locals, but I think it's probably closer to like maybe around here, as opposed to like the bottom end of C tier. Once again, though, like C tier is kind of just like a free-for-all. Red-green Luffy. I don't really see this deck doing very well, unfortunately. I kind of want to just bump it down. Does it belong in a lower tier? Yeah, I don't know. We'll leave it here. It's like one where you could probably build it very well because it has some decent supernova support, of course. Overall, I just don't see it doing very well. And I don't think it's a free deck either. I think that you could probably build it to a point where you're very aggressive. You have a Kid and Killer. You have like your Cavendish. You might even want to throw like a 9-cost Zoro in, or just go like super aggro and play like low to the ground. I think this deck I don't know, has suffered from the leader ability being 4. Like, the fact that you have to pay 4 for the leader ability is just way too steep. If it was 3, maybe a little bit more acceptable. 2 would be amazing, but I feel like that's maybe too much to ask for. Hannibal is one where I feel like it probably belongs in the rogue tier. I don't see people play this very often. I don't see people cook with this very often, but I think that this is a leader that just takes advantage of some of the good purple stuff that comes out. The rush unit from Sanji, the rush unit from Luffy, both can be played in this leader, and so that helps its like mid-game a little bit. Not saying that like the Luffy's a mid-game piece, but the Sanji is definitely a mid-game piece that this Hannibal can take care of. I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the last video. Hody Jones and Kinemon both don't really get much as far as new support goes. Green doesn't get much. There's not much new in like the Fishman Pirates. There's not much new in the Land of Wano. For both of these characters, just don't really get much. And as a result, they don't really change in the tier list. King is probably better than what I have it at. We'll probably bump this up to around here. Once again, being a purple leader. Hey, guess what? Purple's really good in the set. I'm going to say it until the end of this video, so get used to it. King is one that I think might benefit from people experimenting around with some of the new stuff. I think King is just a decent leader overall. It's kind of like, I feel like it's a balanced leader. It's not amazing, but it's not bad either. And I think King has potential to do better than maybe a Leave It Locals, but we haven't really seen results with it too often, so we'll leave it here. Then also with Z, we could bump Z up a little bit because it's kind of the same boat as a purple-black leader, but I think slightly worse than King, because King at least has like a game plan of being able to like draw a card a turn towards the end game, so you're not like going down too far in hand size. You can also like use a minus ability with King if you like, but Z is only going to be able to pop something, I think it's like 3 or less by minusing Dawn. Not a problem, but it's very specific on what it wants to do. Whereas like King has a little bit more flexibility in its game plan. So I think these still belong in the Leave It Locals for now. But we might see like maybe King do a little bit better. I don't expect Z to do that well though. All right, Red Purple Kid. Now this one is going to be like the spicy pick of the video. I'm going to put this deck at the bottom of event hopping. I know this sounds weird. It's like going from C tier to A tier, but it got a lot of random support in OP09. It gets like a restand character. It can take advantage of all the purple stuff. It takes advantage of all the red stuff. The fact that it's a 2-color leader and at 5 life, but it can attack. And the stipulation is you minus a Dawn, but there's like cards that don't care about you minusing Dawn, like the 5-cost Kid. You have Pudding, like you could play. This leader, I just feel like has a lot of potential to do very well in OP09 because everybody else might be looking at other stuff. I think that Red Purple Kid will take some people by surprise. I don't know if people will play it. I hope people play it. Please, if you're watching this video and you've gotten to this point, please, somebody try this leader out. I promise you that this leader is not bad anymore. It's not a Leave It Locals. It's a good leader. So I think this leader deserves a little bit of recognition, especially with the support that it gets. I think we can safely bump the other leaders that are purple up to around the same tier as the other purple leaders here. I feel like this row is pretty solid. And then we start to taper off around the chopper to the bottom of this. I think that King kind of just doesn't... It's like if you're playing King, you just play this Kaido. They're very similar, but King's ability's only online when he's at 10 Dawn. But because of that, you're kind of just playing a vanilla leader up until that point, but it does still have good purple stuff. This blue-purple Kaido has just historically never done very well, and I'm not sure what the reason is for that. I feel like maybe it's just not good against like aggro decks, and there's always like some kind of aggro deck that really runs it over. Hey, Doflamingo is an aggro deck, and it probably will run it over. That being said, I still think that these decks could have some merit at like a local level, but I don't think these decks will do very well at the top end of like big tournaments. And then to wrap up the C tier, we have the Garp, the red-black Garp. I still feel like this is here. Even with red getting a little bit of a buff, I don't think Garp really takes advantage of it. If you're going to play a red-black leader, play red-black Sabo, because I feel like that leader effect is just generically better than the minusing Dawn by placing Dawn underneath characters, because that synergy just doesn't exist. This leader feels like a mistake when it was made. I don't know. Or maybe like Bandai had just had like huge foresight that they saw like 20 sets in advance and were like, oh, this Garp's going to be good once we get to OP21. You know, like I feel like this leader just kind of doesn't feel good as a leader right now. Let's quickly go through the free tier and see if anything here changes. I don't really feel like this is a good leader overall. Nothing really changes for this. Magellan could be bumped up to the Leave It Locals because, yeah, well, purple stuff is good. This Lucci is just not really great, so we're going to keep him here. Kairos, sadly, just doesn't really do much with the black or the yellow stuff right now. Now, Blue Purple Croc, I'm going to bump this up here because I think that the 9-cost Luffy is actually really good in this leader. And I feel like this leader could be decent, but I don't think good enough to be at a big tournament. Its matchup spread is like all over the place. I haven't really touched upon like the matchup spread for like the C tier decks, but just as like a general overview, it can win against anything, but it can also lose against anything, and it will probably lose to things more often than they win. So that's why a lot of these are in the C tier. But yeah, I feel like this might have a weird matchup spread. I also feel like not enough people are going to be playing this for it to really see any like light of day. But it could be a deck that could be taken to a local and who knows, do very well. Now, I've been talking about purple being a very good color overall in this set. However, Purple Shanks is definitely just still bad. It's just like the leader effect is too specific, and there's nothing really that it gets to make it better. You could, I guess, run just generic purple stuff and make it like a generic purple leader, but that kind of just feels weird. Why would you want to do that? So I am going to leave this here. Isho, I don't think is good yet. I think Isho might get some support in 10 that will make it better, but Not yet. It's still in the F tier. I think Black Yellow Lin Lin is also not really that great, but I don't think it's necessarily an F tier. You might bump it up to the C tier because I think that there are some, things that I don't really know about this leader that probably some people do. Just from my own experience, don't think it's great, but I do see some people doing very well with it, and I also do respect the fact that it can do well with some of the new yellow stuff. But overall, I don't expect this leader to do very well. We will bump it up to the C tier just because I don't think being an F tier is quite fair for it. I think Kuro doesn't really get much new. It might actually have a decent Doflamingo matchup. But I don't know if that warrants it to be good enough to bump out of the F tier. So we're going to leave it here. I'm going to move this Luffy up because it does get some access to red stuff that could be just decent for it. But it's not really a leader I feel you would want to take to a tournament. Black Luffy, yet again, kind of just doesn't do much. Yamato, I think, can bump up out of the F tier because of the Nico Robin. I think that Nico Robin is just incredibly powerful. I also think the fact that it gets access to things like Dareshi if it really wants to run it and pull out triggers from your top 5 so that you can have counter events or maybe even 2K counters or just anything that has trigger in it would be really nice. So I think Yamato bumps up to the C tier. I think that Croc kind of just stays where it's at. Same thing with this Luffy. This Uta will probably always be in the F tier, sadly. Green, blue Sanji doesn't really get much either in what it needs to be a decent leader. The Sakazuki is just awful. I don't know why this was made. This Law, I'm actually going to bump up to the Rogue tier because I don't know if it is good or not. And the reason why I'm putting it up here this far is because, well, we did see a small support piece come out for it with Shachi and Penguin in OP09. It's a 4-cost 5,000 power body that when attacking, minus something by 2,000 power. This leader definitely is a neutered version of the old Red Purple Law, but I don't know if it's that awful. It could be a leader that just needs a little bit of help. It's in purple. Hey, guess what? It's in purple. Purple's good, but does it take advantage of some of the purple stuff? Not quite sure if this leader does, but regardless, I think this leader would be a leader that I don't want to discredit and say it's just awful. So I'm going to put it in the Rogue tier because I think that maybe there is some potential for it to be worked on. I have seen some lists that did surprise me, and I could see this leader actually being decent with enough time and enough support. I don't know if 09 is the time and support for it, but hey, maybe someone out there can surprise me. Of course, dead as a doorknob, these two don't exist anymore. Rest in peace to these bad boys. All right, on to OP09, the leaders from OP09. Now that we have basically what I think is a good structure from OP09 tier list for all the existing leaders, we have Sanji, which I didn't cover, but is a PRB leader. It came out with the premium booster, and I think Sanji is a decent deck overall. I think it's probably competitive, probably towards the tail end of competitive. So the good thing about Sanji is it has an amazing Blackbeard matchup. If you expect a lot of Blackbeard at your locals, if you expect a lot of Blackbeard at bigger tournaments, Sanji could be a good meta pick. However, Sanji struggles against Doflamingo. I think it struggles against a lot of the other decks in the meta. And because of its struggle against the decks above it, all of these up here, I sadly don't think it's super competitive, but the fact that it just absolutely dunks on Teach makes it a deck worth potentially playing at a big tournament because it could be a response to Teach, right? And so because it's a direct response to Teach, this leader will always kind of simply just sit there in that competitive tier, probably forever at the B tier. And of course, it's a red leader, so it does get access to red stuff, right? So, but the fact that it just answers Teach directly is really strong for it. All right, next up we have Shanks, and I'm going to put Shanks at the top of A tier. I think when people first saw this leader, they thought the effect was not very good. And minusing one attack by minus 1,000 power every turn, what is that really doing? It's actually doing a lot over the course of a game. You have kind of like an invisible card advantage. Every turn you're gaining an additional 1k counter in your hand in the form of your leader ability. The fact that some of your other cards do power reduction coupled with your leader ability make this a very interesting, almost like a control style red deck. Could also be a defensive or even a very aggro style red deck. There's a lot of different avenues of play here. I think that it does have a little bit of difficulty against Doflamingo. I think some builds do well against it. I think some builds struggle against it. I think if you're building to beat Doflamingo, you're giving up your purple Luffy matchup a little bit. That matchup's a little rough. But mostly, here's the good thing about Shanks. You are a 50-50 leader for the most part. I think every matchup you come across is 50-50. Other than Red Purple Luffy, I think that matchup is absolutely just awful. Red Purple Luffy does exactly what you do, but faster. So because of that, it is a really rough matchup for you. However, Shanks just does well against a lot of the other decks. Like I said, 50-50 across the board. But I think Doflamingo is one that you want to be able to beat consistently, and I think you can. And I think it can beat Teach. I think it can beat Purple Luffy. I think it can beat Black Yellow Luffy. But it also can lose to these just as easily. I think it might be a pilot difference at the end of the day. Next up, we have Lim in green and purple, a 4-life leader. Basically, you're able to play out Odyssey characters by paying 3 and then ramping a Dawn, and they come in rested. All of your units come in rested. I think that this leader, the fact that it ramps up pretty quickly is nice, but ramping up to stuff that maybe could be answered pretty easily by other things in the meta is not necessarily a good feeling. I think against Shanks, against like Lucci, against decks that are more control-oriented in nature, Lim will struggle against, and I think we're going to see a lot of these in the top tier. So because of that, I think Lim belongs in the C tier. I think that it can be a deck that could do well as time goes on, and maybe more people try it out and play with it, but off the bat, I just don't think it's that good. Next up, we have a mono blue buggy leader that just says, once per turn, activate main. You can pay 5 Dawn, pitch a card from hand, and then play a cross-guild type card from your hand. So you are basically cheating out bodies that are higher than 5 in cost, which is very nice. You also are able to play multiple bodies a turn with that effect, because some bodies that you can play will play out multiple. Like the 7-cost Crocodile plays out a 5-cost. That's really nice to be able to gain tempo and build up a board very quickly. So the mid game for Buggy is very crucial and a strong point for this leader. However, the fact that it's board, once it's answered, it's hard to rebuild it nearly as fast, and you're wanting to be able to build a board wide so that you can play your 10-cost Buggy and have it stick. The 10-cost Buggy on play bottom decks anything on your opponent's side of the field, and if you have, I think it's like up to, I think if you have 5 characters that are 5 cost or more on your side of the field, then it stays. Otherwise, it gets bottom decked itself. So, of course, building a board is very important for Buggy. But if your board is constantly being answered by things like Shanks or like any kind of Boa effect or like maybe a Lucci, Buggy's going to have a hard time. I think it's a rogue deck for now. It will eventually get a piece, like a promo card, that will make it a much better deck than it is currently. The promo piece being a 7-cost, 8,000 power Buggy card that says your opponent's characters that are 3 or 4 cost cannot attack, which will shut down Doflamingo and give Buggy a fighting chance against that deck as well. So it belongs in C+ rogue tier for now. I think it could potentially do well, but it's just not good enough, in my opinion, to be a super competitive deck. Next up, we have Nico Robin, which is a 4-life leader in purple and yellow. She has Banish, which is incredibly powerful. And she also has an effect that says when attacking, you may pitch a trigger card from your hand, and you may add 1 Rest Dawn to your Dawn. And that's very nice because you can ramp up while attacking and get rid of some dead cards in hand as well. So Nico Robin, though, is, yellow is not necessarily in the strongest spot at the moment. However, I do think this deck is pretty solid. I've played quite a bit of it, and I think it could be a decent deck. I don't think it's quite competitive. I do think it's probably the top of the rogue decks, in my opinion. I do really like how this leader plays. I like it being able to ramp up to the big yellow bodies quickly. I think the fact that you have Banish on your leader is also something very interesting. You could go more of a starve route with this leader and play cards like the 6-cost Nico Robin, the 7-cost Lin Lin, and then use your leader to like bait out counters. That's very strong. So I think that's good, but I think other decks above it are definitely better. Next up, we have Purple Black Luffy. This is a leader that says Dawn ×1, your characters have +1 to their cost. And then once per turn, if you -2 or more Dawn, you can add 1 Dawn from your Dawn deck rested and 1 Dawn from your Dawn deck active. So you are able to use these minusing effects and then gain Dawn to be able to use for extra attacks or for your leader ability, having the +1 cost, or just leaving a Dawn open for the 1-cost event. I think this leader is very versatile in how it plays. It plays a lot of good stuff, a lot of top end that's very strong. You can play Moria, you can play the 9-cost Kaido, you can play the 10-cost Kaido and Linlin, you can play the 10-cost Time Walk Luffy. There's a lot of things that this deck can do, and I think it's a very powerful deck. I think it's probably around a solid competitive tier. I might want to put it around here. I don't know if it's like super great. The problem is it gets shut down very easily by Blackbeard, and I think the fact that it's 4 life does hurt it a little bit, but the fact it ramps up very fast to be able to play big bodies and get a lot of good recursion makes it a very strong leader. It can draw through its deck very quickly, by the way, with a lot of the effects that it gets. The 4-cost Frankie blocker, being able to repeatedly, with the Moria bringing it back, draw you cards. Overall, very strong. You could also play more of a control style with this leader. There's a lot of different ways to build it, and I think that this is an exciting leader to play. Not necessarily the best leader, but I do think that it has a little bit of edge against a lot of the other decks. And then finally, we have Blackbeard, Mr. Teach himself. I think this leader is probably towards the bottom of the S tier. I don't think it's the best deck in the format quite yet. Let's see if we can move this up here. I think the Teach belongs around here for now. As we go along, this deck will become better and better. It is a deck that rewards a person that knows the game very well, knows a lot of matchups, and knows what the opponent's deck is supposed to be doing. So you have to know every leader in the game. You have to know when to use your leader ability appropriately. You have to know how to KO the appropriate things, when to play your Burgesses, when to play your 10-cost Teaches, which is probably on 10, but maybe you don't. I think this leader requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of practice in order for it to be good. And I think a lot of people off the bat will go to play this leader and find out that this leader is not as easy as they think it will be. However, the people that do put a lot of time into it, the people that are very knowledgeable in the game, will make this the best deck in the format for sure. But because overall, it's not necessarily a deck that rewards everybody that plays it, I think it belongs at the bottom of S tier. Still a very good place to be, right? I think this deck will see a lot of tops with, and I think it will make a very interesting meta overall. It's a leader that will probably be a very competitive leader from here until the end of One Piece, whenever that will be. Hopefully never, but I think the fact that it just has a generic ability, I didn't even talk about the ability. That's just like how excited I am about this leader coming out and changing up the meta. This leader ability just says your on-play abilities don't happen, they don't take place. And then once per turn, you can pitch a card from your hand and your opponent's on-play abilities don't take place for an entire turn. So that's incredibly powerful because a lot of cards, a lot of leaders, a lot of characters are on play, have on-play abilities, and being able to shut those down at pivotal moments really turns the tide back into the favor of Teach, being able to then pull ahead in different ways outside of, just your typical like remove things from the board. I think the fact that the on-play abilities are negated is such an interesting ability. And I think that, like I said, it will reward a really strong and competent pilot. Not everybody will do well with this leader, but I think the people that will put time into it will see a lot of tops with Blackbeard. There you have it. This is my opinion on what I think are the best decks in OP09. I think that we're going to see a very diverse meta. I'm excited for the change. I think that for 7 and 8, a lot of people felt like it was very stale, a lot of the same things over and over again. But because we have a lot of interesting new leaders that bring some good power creep into the meta, and I say good power creep, I mean just like it changes the meta so much that we're going to see a lot of different leaders topping, a lot of different leaders at these events, and that's exciting. That's very fresh for the game. I think it's a very fun time to play. Let me know what you guys think about the tier list. I would love to hear what you guys think are good leaders overall. The only thing I ask is please be respectful in the comments. Would love to hear from you though, and please make sure to join the giveaway, of course, that's going on for the next 2 weeks. I appreciate the support as always, and I'll see you guys in the next video.